I want to make sure we finish on time. I know you all have dinners to get to and things like that. So, wow, people settled right down. What a crowd. So, I guess while I have your attention, then I'll get right into it here. So, just some housekeeping. If you could all turn your phones to vibrate or silent or turn them off, that would be appreciated. If you could please make sure that you complete the evaluation form from this convention. You'll receive an email tomorrow with a link and all of the feedback. I know you're going to say, tomorrow I'm flying. We really take this feedback seriously, and if there are things you don't like about the convention, and we know there always are little things, please let us know how we can do things better next year. And in particular, I want to say, are there any parents here in the audience? Parents, if you're a parent, raise your hand. Raising hands. Look at all those hands. So next year, we're considering offering childcare at the convention, and we have questions in this year's evaluation about childcare, who would want it, what it would look like, and things like that. So if you're interested in that, please make sure you fill out that evaluation. We'd love to get those data. Next year is the 53rd annual convention, and the meeting will be held in Atlanta at the Marriott Marquis. Please mark your calendar. The meeting is November 21 to 24. We have lots of exciting things planned already. I also want to remind you to come to the Saturday night dance party. Yeah, sometimes known as the prom. So it will be here in this room, and the party starts at 10:30. Yeah, I know. Tom, take a nap, Tom. So it's like there was a conspiracy of the cool people, because I will definitely not be awake when that party starts. Maybe I'll set an alarm. So at the end of the presidential address, I'm going to ask that people stay seated. Now, you may forget, because there'll be this very compelling address that you're going to get all excited about, but I'm going to ask you to stay seated because I have a plaque to give on behalf of the association to Sabine for her service as president. So one quick thing before I get started with my real formal introduction, I'd like to ask Angela to come up. We're going to take a photo of all of you to go on the ABCT Facebook page. You don't have to get up. Everyone, I see nervous looks. You look wonderful, by the way. You look fantastic. You're all going to be on the ABCT Facebook page, and the only catch is that Sabine and I will be really in the foreground, and you're going to be way in the background. So is Angela here? She's right behind me. Okay. Hold still. You're just right where you are. You look great. Okay. Stand by the podium. Okay. We're new at this. Wow. This is exciting. Okay. Thank you. Okay, wow. Whew. You're in that photo, as promised. So let me jump right in with the introduction, because I want to leave time for the talk, and there's a lot to say. Our president, Sabine Wilhelm, is such an accomplished person, and I could take the entire hour here to go over some of these accomplishments, but many of you all know her already. She's a thought leader on OCD, body dysmorphic disorder, and related disorders. She's chief of psychology and director of OCD and related disorders program at MGH. She has over 240 publications. She's published 7 books. 220 invited lectures. This will be 221, I guess. Congratulations. She has a long history of grant funding, 7 NIH grants, an H-index of 62, so one of the rare individuals whose H-index is higher than their age. That's like a special club to be in. Hard to get into that club. And she's published a modular cognitive behavior therapy for BDD. I'm a big fan of modular cognitive behavior therapy. That's good. Developed multiple smartphone-delivered treatments, so a lot of mobile delivery of evidence-based programs for OCD, social anxiety, depression, is really a leader in that area. She's vice chair of the Scientific Advisory Board for the International OCD Foundation. She's on the Scientific Council for ADAA. Look at all these things. I only have 18 more slides of this, so hold tight. She's had multiple editorial appointments, including working on our flagship journal, Behavior Therapy. So I could continue, but I think what we want to do is kind of step back and do a deep dive into this. So how does someone become so accomplished? How did this all begin? Someone who decides they want to study anxiety and depression and obsessions, and then they become so accomplished. So I'm going to tell that story in just a few moments, and a couple of disclaimers. I really met Sabine only this past year in working together, so I don't know any of these details, but I was given photographs by her family and by Barbara Rosenberg. And so my interpretation of all of this is based on the photographs I have that have no story other than what I'm about to make up for you. So here goes. And we're sort of twins in a way. We have some strange things in common. One of them is we both have families from Germany. So Sabine grew up in Kirchhausen, which is a small town near Frankfurt, well, south of Frankfurt, kind of in the Odenwald, and very small, population 1,200, so it's a little bit more people than are in this room, but not much. About 2 square miles, so this is where she grew up, and this is going to start to give us some insight into how she grew into the person she is today. So here's one of the photographs I have, and I'm told this is the first known incident of a parent-guided in vivo exposure. This is her mother leading her to touch the dirtiest trash can in Kirchhausen. And you can see that that's her brother in the background there, and he's looking on, which is important because later he begins to lead exposures. Here they are touching the dirty grill of the car after a family road trip. And now Suds had not reached Kirchhausen by then, so we didn't know how to take ratings, but if you look closely at the facial expressions, you can see that there was absolutely no progress over many years of exposure. So maybe this led her to think, I should do something about this, which she did when she had a little sister, and she became so happy that now she could practice on someone. So her little sister was born, and she went to school. She became so confident. If you know Sabine, you know how organized she is. And so, of course, here she is with her name on her shirt. So she knows who she is. Everyone else knows who she is, right? First day of school. That is the first day of school. And so as she grew older, she began to get more confident. And here she is with her father, practicing what eventually became her very assertive mentorship style and leadership style. So I think that's what that is. So what does she grow up into? Well, we have to look at the adolescent years. So here she is as a teenager. Look at that. Look at that expression of utter joy on her face, right? And so you might ask, well, what do teenagers in Kirchhausen do for fun? And clearly, they stack firewood into neat piles, which somehow is related to OCD, I think. So there are many clues in these pictures. So then she met Arun. You could see the cool years began with the sunglasses. They met in the early 90s. Of course, then they got married. She began her family. Isn't that lovely? Those are beautiful pictures. Her family is right here in the front row, by the way. She did a research placement at Lehigh. That's where they met. And then her family began. And so she has 2 children, Sarah, 17, and Mark, who's 14. They're also, Mark, I know, is here in the front row. I see Mark. And this looks like, I'm thinking that picture on the right there is a height exposure. They're about to sled off a cliff. And so she's now practicing. And you can see how this just carries forward. But Sabine has changed. I mean, she didn't raise her kids to stack firewood. She takes her teenagers around the world. They travel, they have fun. And so things eventually changed for her, and she became this social person and going places. And so here she is with her collaborators now. I have some pictures of her with her mentors and her colleagues and her collaborators. And this is where I need to get a bit serious. I looked at these pictures, and it reminds me of what I got to know about Sabine this year, which is she is so accomplished and has cultivated so many relationships and collaborators. And if you know her, you know how immediately likable she is, and passionate about things. This is a picture of her doing fundraising for OCD. So she participates in every aspect of the work, not just the science, but in the community involvement and the awareness and the charity work as well. So I'm going to wrap things up there and just say, it has been an amazing experience for me coming into ABCT governance, getting to know Sabine. She brings energy, optimism, enthusiasm, and a brightness to everything that we've done for the organization. It's just been an amazing year. We're very lucky to have her. And I know this is her shining moment, but I also just want to say that it's also the year I got to know Mary Jane and Gail, and they too have really been an amazing group. They're my orientation to ABCT governance, and it's been fantastic. But we need to get to the star of the show now. And so what you've all been waiting for, Sabine is going to talk to us about all of her great work. So I'm going to quickly switch these computers while she comes on up here to talk to us. Sabine Wilhelm, please join me in welcoming her. Okay. This is our little dance.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That was incredible. So much fun. So I was looking forward to this moment for a really long time. And what I'll do today is I'll talk to you about CBT in the digital age. But before I do so, I will show you my disclosures. And I also want to thank all of the wonderful people who have helped me make this talk, and they're all here. Hilary Weingarten, Nick Jacobson, Jen Greenberg, Val Bradick, Ilana Lattis, and Chin Chin. Bruce said I'll talk about all the wonderful work I've done. It's actually not entirely true. It's true that if I would have given this talk at ABCT a few years ago, I would have probably talked about OCD or body dysmorphic disorder or Tourette syndrome, because I spent about 20 years or so developing and testing treatments for these disorders. And so have many others, actually. And despite all of the work that we've done, we actually haven't had the impact that we thought we would have by now, because many people with these disorders and people with mental disorders in general are still not getting any treatment at all, and many of those who do actually don't get good treatment. So today, instead of talking about OCD or BTD or Tourette's, I'm going to talk about the mental health crisis that our field is facing and how we might use technology in order to address this. So here is our roadmap for our talk today. We'll start by talking about the mental health crisis. Then we'll talk about technology as a possible solution. I'll mostly talk about internet-based CBT and smartphone-based CBT, because those fit very well with ABCT themes, even though, of course, there are many other possible technology solutions. Then I'll talk a little bit about the different areas where we still need to learn things. And then I'll wrap it up by talking about future directions, discuss sensor-based assessment, as well as treatment. And then I'll talk about how we might put it all together in a comprehensive mental health treatment platform. So let's talk about the mental health crisis. As you all know, mental disorders are extremely prevalent. Take a look at these NAMI fact sheets, and you can see that approximately 1 in 5 adults in the United States, so that's about 43 million people, experience mental illness in a given year. And about half of all chronic mental illness actually begins by the age of 14. So that means that there are many people out there who are suffering, and they get sick when they're pretty young. And mental illness is also extremely costly. mental disorders now account for over $200 billion in annual health expenditures. So they are more costly than any other disorder. They are more costly than heart disease, and they are more costly than cancer. And despite all this, despite all of that money being spent, 60% of people who currently meet a diagnosis for a psychiatric disorder are receiving no care at all. And of those who do, only very few, about 38%, receive at least minimally adequate care. And a related problem is that people are suffering for a long period of time, often without getting any help whatsoever. We did a study in our OCD program at Mass General a few years ago, and we found that it took people about 10 years from the time they got sick until they finally first received treatment. Now, why is that? What are the barriers that people are experiencing to accessing mental health care? Well, first of all, there are really important patient-level barriers, right? So the patients will say that, I don't know how to get to appointments, I don't have transportation, or I can't take time off work in order to get to my therapy appointments, or I don't have childcare. And many will also say that they are still worried about the significant stigma that's associated with admitting to having a psychiatric problem and with just walking into the office of a therapist. And the cost of receiving care to the individual patient can also be extremely high. And there was one study in bulimia nervosa, and they were receiving 18 sessions of CBT for bulimia nervosa, and it was found that the direct cost to the patient was $1,600. And I live in Boston, actually, where patients often wind up paying out of pocket for their treatment, and they often pay hundreds of dollars per treatment session. So you can easily spend $5,000 or so on a course of therapy. But even when patients overcome all of these barriers that I was talking about, all of these patient-based barriers, they're still experiencing system barriers to receiving care. So I already talked about that I live in Boston. And of course, Boston is actually known about being a great city with great healthcare infrastructure. We're a relatively large city, right? And so comparatively, you would think that we are doing pretty well. But even for us in Boston, when I look for a referral for a patient, it takes me a long time to find someone. When they do, if they want to use their insurance, they often have to wait up to a year or so before receiving care. And now take a look at this slide, right? And this slide shows you the number of licensed psychologists per 100,000 population. And I don't know if the cursor works. Does it work? Yes. So you can see here the dark colors are good, right? Because that means that we have over 80 psychologists per 100,000 people. So the entire Northeast is actually relatively good. But now take a look at the rest of the country. There are very often fewer than 10 psychologists in more rural areas, right? And this problem gets even worse when you look at it at the global level. So there are large areas, like there's an entire continent, actually, and this is now for psychiatrists, but there are large areas where you have less than one psychiatrist per 100,000 people. And more problematically, if you look at data from the World Health Organization, you find that on average, there are fewer than 10 mental health care workers per 100,000 within Africa, Southeast Asia, the Eastern Mediterranean, as well as the Western Pacific. So there are huge problems in terms of provider availability. We have a major provider shortage, and that's a big barrier to treatment. And I know that many of you are psychologists, so I thought we could do a little thought experiment together. And this is now just for the United States. But if all licensed psychologists in the United States worked for 50 hours a week, right, and they wouldn't do anything else but conduct psychotherapy, they could only address a tiny sliver, only 12% of the need of people with mental illness. So and of course I know that not all patients are being treated by psychologists, but still what this teaches us is that our current approach, the way we currently think about healthcare, and doesn't work because it relies heavily on the idea that one provider gives individual face-to-face care to one patient, and that's just not sufficiently scalable. But fortunately, I think technology might provide us with some solutions, and I'm going to talk about internet-based CBT first, because this was one of the early approaches. So internet-based CBT usually takes what would have been kind of self-help material and puts it on the web. It puts it in an online format. And then patients can sit down on their home computer, on their laptop at home, if they choose to do so, and then they can read about psychoeducation, or they can complete a CBT worksheet. And of course, because they can do it at home on their own time, that helps them overcome some of the barriers that we talked about. And there have been a number of important pioneers in this area, important people here in the US, but there's been a lot of exciting work going on internationally, in Australia, for example, lots of cool studies coming out of Europe, and I know that several of you are here, actually. I know that Christian Rick is here from the Karolinska Institute. He does this kind of work. I think Per Karlbring is here. Gerhard Andersen has done a lot of really interesting studies in this area, and I hope that many of you saw the excellent keynote by Pim Kuipers yesterday. And I already talked a little bit about the advantage of internet-based CBT being able to be completed in a patient's home. Another big advantage of internet-based CBT is that it so much limits the therapist's time. For example, Bruce already mentioned, I do quite a bit of work in CBT for body dysmorphic disorder. And the average course of CBT for body dysmorphic disorder is anywhere between 16 to 22 sessions. So it's a relatively long treatment for a relatively severe disorder. And Christian Rick's teams at the Karolinska Institute recently completed a study, and they found that there was only about it was less than 3 hours of therapist time that was required to help those patients, because again, most of the treatment was delivered over the internet. And not only does internet-based CBT greatly reduce the need for therapist time, but it's also quite powerful as a treatment. For example, there is a meta-analysis by Christian Rick on psychiatric disorders as well as somatoform disorders that showed that guided internet-based CBT is actually equivalent to in-person CBT in terms of its outcome. So that's pretty exciting, and that's probably because, again, the treatment is very standardized. There's no therapist drift. So what's great about internet-based CBT is that it addresses some of the key barriers that I was just talking about, and it's quite effective. But there is still a bit of an issue with it. So because the treatment might encourage patients to leave the house at times, right? And that's good. But still, most of the learning occurs in one space. Most of the learning still occurs at home in front of that home computer. And I know many of you, and I know that many of you are clinicians, and you are very well aware that your patients might experience symptoms pretty much at any time or in any place. So the question really is there a way that we can get treatment into the hands of patients so that they have help whenever and wherever their symptoms occur? And I'm just wondering, who in the room right now has a smartphone in their hand or in their pocket? And yeah, some people are holding up their smartphone. Yes, so yes, of course you do. And that's, you know, that's normal, that's typical, because 75% of people in the United States, 75% of the adults in the United States actually have a smartphone. And smartphone rates, or smartphone ownership, I should say, has doubled in the last 6 years. Right? So it's very typical for us to use these phones. And as you can see here, and I feel like I should be a salesperson for AT&T or Verizon, but you can see the coverage rates, the cellular coverage rates in the United States are incredible, right? You can get service pretty much anywhere you are in the United States. And now compare that with a provider map that I just showed you for psychologists just a few minutes ago. So the question is, given that we are so used to relying on these phones, could we find a way to perhaps also use them for treatment? And I think they provide a huge opportunity, because I bet all of you, or many of you, have used an app in the last few days to help you in some way, one way or another, with your life. I know myself, I've taken an Uber just in the last couple of days, right? So I needed the Uber app, I needed Maps in order to find my way around here, I needed Venmo to send money to my daughter, and I'm sure that's true for most of you, right? Most of us rely on these apps in order to help us with our day-to-day lives. So why not use the phone? Why not use these apps in order to help people with mental illness? And in fact, this is already happening. There are actually thousands of mental health apps on the market already. And these apps are used very frequently, or at least they're designed to be used very frequently and briefly throughout the day. And that's kind of nice, right? Because that way they might generalize better might fit better in the fabric of our day-to-day lives, right? Because we can use these apps whenever or wherever we need them. And they're apps for all kinds of problems. So they're apps that we can use for symptom monitoring, and then there are single skill apps. So what you see here is a behavioral activation app from David Moore's group. There are mindfulness apps. There are apps that you can use together with a therapist. There are apps that are pretty much standalone treatments that have a built-in therapist. And that therapist might just give you a little bit of time, just a few minutes a week. But so not only are these apps widely available, but their outcomes are actually quite promising. And here you can see that there are meta-analyses for both anxiety as well as depression, and they're superior. These apps are superior to inactive controls with sort of moderate effect sizes. And if you compare them to active controls, the effect sizes are a little bit smaller, but still the apps are superior even there. And in addition to having these promising outcomes, these apps, just like ICBT, address many of these barriers that I was talking about earlier. So I talked about how there are so many people who are in need right now. But again, pretty much everybody has a phone, right? There are no issues with wait times, right? Because the moment you decide that you want to start your treatment, you whip out your phone and you download the app and you're ready to go. There are no logistical barriers. You don't need childcare, or you don't need to drive to an appointment. Again, you just use the app. There are also no issues really with shame or stigma, because if you choose to do so, you can keep your app-based treatment a secret. You don't have to tell anybody that this is what you're doing. And frankly, I also think that the barrier to using an app-based treatment might be much lower, because we are so used, again, to running our fitness programs over the phone, or we have these wellness apps that we all have on our phone. So the step into a psychological treatment app might not be as big in that case. The cost is obviously much lower than face-to-face treatment. And if you find the right app, the quality can be fantastic. I mean, the trick is a little bit in finding the right app, and we'll talk about it in a minute. But once you find it, the care is standardized, and you can find outstanding treatment. So in many ways, you can see how these technology-based interventions I was just talking about can provide solutions to the access to care issues that we currently experience in our brick-and-mortar system. But there's still a few things that we need to learn. And one of the major challenges that we need to address is how we might keep people accountable and engaged. And in fact, most of these mental health struggle with keeping people engaged. And what's pretty typical is what you can see here on this slide. So pretty common for people to just download the app, but never coming back. So what you can see here is that in this particular instance, over 100,000 people were downloading the app, but see how few people converted to a next day user, or next week user, or next year user. So that's a real issue, and what can we do about that? Well, you know, it's possible that people simply aren't ready for these technology-based treatments that we have developed. And maybe they just need a little bit of that human touch, right? So maybe they need somebody who watches over them a little bit so that they still feel cared for and that they still feel accountable and that they still feel engaged. And that's why so often, both in internet-based CBT as well as in smartphone-based CBT, you have built-in therapist time. And actually, we just recently completed a study, and that built-in therapist time was only 3 minutes, so it's per week. So it can be very, very limited to keep people engaged. But more recently, people have also come up with other solutions that almost kind of mimic the role of a real therapist. And one interesting idea are chatbots. So those chatbots use natural language processing in order to deliver micro-interventions like support and sometimes even a little bit of CBT via these fluid text conversations that you can see here. And one of my favorites here are these AI therapists or virtual agents. This is usually a computer-delivered treatment, and you can see that cameras are being used in order to track the facial expression of the patient or the body posture, and sensors are also tracking the sound of the voice of the patient, and then they are using machine learning in order to recognize the patient's emotions and to identify it, and then to respond appropriately. It's really fascinating work. Sim Sensei has a video on their website, and it's really fascinating because these virtual agents are actually quite good, so I would encourage you to check it out. And last but not least, there are these peer support networks, and they are basically anonymous, virtual, moderated spaces where stakeholders with similar problems can get together and they can talk to each other anonymously, but they can give each other advice and they can give each other tips. And you can see it here. It's super popular, right? Over 28 million people have used this service. So this is an approach that's incredibly scalable. But there's a word of caution here. Even though this work is incredibly exciting, it's still very much in the early stages, and there's not so much research support in those areas yet. So, of course, one way to make our internet-based and our smartphone-based treatments more engaging is to build in a therapist or to mimic a therapist in some way. Another way is, of course, to make these apps and internet-based treatments as engaging as possible right from the get-go. And in order to do that, you have to engage relevant stakeholders right from the outset. And who are the stakeholders? Well, first of all, there are patients, right? So they can tell us what they need and what they don't need and what's going to be helpful for them. Then there are also clinicians. They might be helpful with talking about what's empirically supported or what's safe for the patients. And that's actually an issue. Can you see it right here? Over 67% of healthcare apps that are currently out there have been developed without the input of a healthcare provider. So that's kind of concerning, actually. And then, of course, you also want to involve the healthcare system more broadly. For example, you want to think about developing this app, but how does it integrate, for example, with the electronic medical record, right? Or how would third-party payers feel about this app? You know, Blue Cross Blue Shield, would they want to offer that to the patients who are using their services? So you have to think a little bit more broadly. And you also have to work, I think, right from the get-go, you want to think about working with engineers and designers because they have the ability to make these apps much more fun and much more engaging than us mental health care providers are typically able to do. You know, because they might gamify it and they have all of these different ways to make patients go back or go up different levels and so on. And this is what ultimately, if it's fun, this is what ultimately drives people back to the treatment. So as Bruce also mentioned, so my own program has started to develop CBT apps for a range of disorders in the last year or so. And we were worried about this engagement problem right from the beginning. So we tried to use our own advice, actually, and we asked 5 of our former patients to help us. Our first app was a BDD app, an app for body dysmorphic disorder. And our patients were great because they gave us advice right from the beginning in terms of what they wanted to see in the app, and then they advised us throughout the development process. And of course, we also had designers help us make the app maybe a little bit more fun than what we would have been able to do. We had engineers help us make it run smoothly. So, and it worked out pretty well, I have to say. So in terms of engagement, when we first tested it with 10 patients, we didn't lose anybody. So all of the 10 patients stayed with the program, and they kept coming back and kept using it over the course of the 12 weeks. And in terms of outcome, we also did pretty well. So what you can see here, they started out with a BDD-YBOX score of 30. And a BDD-YBOX score of 30 means that they were actually pretty moderately to severely ill. So these patients were pretty sick, even though we had recruited them over the internet and over Facebook and so on. So despite the fact that we used this internet-based and Facebook-based recruitment strategy, the patients were just as sick as those patients who typically just kind of walk into our clinic, right, and are asking for face-to-face treatments. And then over the course of the 12 weeks, you can see it right here, their BDD symptoms dropped to a BDD-YBOX score of around a 15. And what that means is that they were coming down to subclinical levels. So a score of 20 is usually associated with a BDD diagnosis. So they were coming down to the subclinical range, and then they were able to maintain their gains in that follow-up period. So that was pretty exciting for us because, and again, we only needed 12 weeks for that. The reason why they might have responded so well is because even though their BDD symptom severity was just as severe as what we typically see in live treatment, their suicidality and depression level was a little bit lower or significantly lower, what we tend to see in face-to-face treatment. So they might not be the exact same population, but still it was very, very promising that patients did so well with a smartphone-based treatment. And now, of course, these were only 10 patients, right, because it was a feasibility and acceptability study. Now we need to test this in a larger sample, which actually brings me to my next point. Another area where we still have to do a lot of learning is that we have to gather empirical support for those apps that are being developed, and we also have to pay a lot more attention to data security. So only about 2 to 4% of depression and anxiety-focused apps that are currently out there and that are currently available for download have an evidence-based. That's shocking, right? So we need to do much better than that. And so right now what's happening is that there's so many apps coming on the market all the time that the research is really lacking behind. So the growth of apps is completely outpacing the evidence-based for the apps. And similarly, actually, the growth of app-based treatment is also outpacing our thinking around security concerns, because one way, and a very common way to monetize apps, is to basically sell the data of the users to third parties, right? And most patients don't know this. And as you can see here on this slide, the risk to losing your privacy when you use these apps is actually very, very high. So if you are out there and you are developing technology-based treatments, if you are developing app-based treatments, or even if you are recommending apps to your patients, this is something that you need to pay attention to. You need to think about what data is being collected with this app, what kind of data is being stored, where is it being stored, and what kind of data is ultimately being shared with third parties. And it's really on us, I think, to think about this, because this field is going to continue to develop, right? Whether we do this or not, this is just going to continue to grow no matter what. There are no official regulating bodies in this field right now that in some ways police these security concerns or these concerns in general that I was just talking about, but there are some great resources that you can use. And one of those resources is CyberGuide. I have to say I'm a little bit biased because I'm on their scientific advisory board, but I think it's a fantastic website that does rate apps in terms of their transparency. So that gives you an idea of how clearly the privacy policy describes how data are being collected and stored and so on. It gives you a rating for the credibility of the app, meaning it gives you some insight into the strengths of the scientific support for this app. And also it gives you, CyberGuide also gives you a rating on the user experience. So that helps you figure out how engaging the app is and how accessible the information is. And of course, we are at ABCT, and ABCT also has a wonderful app rating system through cognitive and behavioral practice, so I recommend that you check that out as well. And most recently, ABCT and CyberGuide decided to form a partnership, so they're now going to pool resources in their app rating approaches. So that's very exciting. The ADAA, Anxiety and Depression Association of America, also rates apps. They actually also have joined resources with CyberGuide recently. And the American Psychiatric Association also has a very nice website where you can find helpful app ratings as well. And about a year ago, there was a very interesting development in this field. The FDA approved a CBT app. The app was called Reset, and it's an app developed by Pear Therapeutic. And it's basically an app that can be used in conjunction with outpatient substance use treatment, CBT substance use treatment. And I think that was a real game changer, because now, all of a sudden, the FDA starts regulating what is basically a CBT treatment, except, of course, that the CBT treatment is delivered on a device. It's delivered on a phone. And I'm just very curious to see what's going to happen going forward. You know, I would actually love to hear from anybody in the audience after the talk. Are all of you app developers out there now going forward? Are you going to seek FDA approval for the apps that you are developing? So anyway, so there's a lot happening in this field. And I think we just have to understand what's going on as we are moving forward. So I'm going to use the last few minutes of my talk to talk a little bit more about where the field is going. And I want to start by talking about sensors. So one of the very, very recent advances in our field is the ability to use phones in order to enhance assessment. And I've thought about this a lot. And in general, I feel that clinicians are not assessing their patients enough. And it's very often that they just don't have enough time to do so, or they don't want to spend very valuable treatment time on assessment. But what that often means, and this is true obviously for typical face-to-face treatment as well, but what this often means is that patients might have months or sometimes even years of treatment without having undergone an assessment. So the clinician might not even fully understand what exactly is going on with their patient, or they might not fully know that the patient is not even really improving. Right? Or the patient might not even, without having done an assessment, the patient also might not come forward and talk about certain things that might perhaps be a little bit embarrassing. And the other problem with regard to assessment in our field is that many of the measures that we use actually cover very long periods of time. Even in the field where I work, it's very common to ask patients about their last week, for example, sometimes even their last month. You know, and who really remembers exactly how they were feeling a month ago or a week ago? So what you're often getting is actually a recency effect. So our assessments might not even be as good as we think they are. And smartphones can really help here in this area as well, because, of course, they typically have upwards of 20 sensors or so on them. And those sensors continuously and passively monitor what's going on with an individual. I mean, just think about yourself, right? So most of you probably use a phone, and that's not even a sensor, actually, that's just a function on the phone, but most of you probably check the phone before you go to bed, right? You might even use an alarm clock to wake yourself up with the phone, and then you check the phone again, right when you wake up in order to check your text messages or the emails that have come in. And therefore, this is a very good indicator, whether your screen is on or off, is a very good indicator of when you were sleeping, right? And then there is a GPS, the GPS sensors on your phone. They give us an idea of how much you are moving around. You know, how much are you traveling around. There is Bluetooth. Bluetooth is fascinating because, you know, when let's say you're always near certain Bluetooth devices on evenings or weekends, right? There are certain Bluetooth devices that always show up at these times. Well, these are probably your friends, right? So there's so much information on these phones. And this information is actually collected without you, or actually in this case also your patients, having to do any extra work. And then we can use machine learning in order to process this information and give us possibly very important, perhaps even diagnostic information about a patient, and we might even be ultimately able to use this information to intervene. Let me give you an example. So let's say you have an individual, a patient who, on your caseload, who has been sleeping fairly regularly for a while now, and then all of a sudden there is a change in sleeping patterns, right? So all of a sudden you notice that they're up most of the time and they're only sleeping for about 3 hours or so a night. You could probably track that with your phone, with their phone. Or they're constantly buzzing around now. They're all of a sudden starting to drive around or so in the middle of the night, right? Because again, you could pick that up with a GPS on their phone. Well, you know, it's possible that this patient is in a manic episode or headed towards a manic episode. And then why not think about using the phone in order to intervene, right? Why not provide a just-in-time intervention in order to help this patient? And in fact, this is already starting to happen. So the team at Northwestern, this is David Moore's group, a few years ago developed an app. It's called the Mobilized App. And this app is designed to infer mood states from sensors on the phone. And then they used, basically, actually, I just want to show you this here. So basically what you can see here is then once they sort of picked up the location of patients, and once they figured out that a patient had been stuck in a particular location for a long period of time, they were able to intervene, and they sent them messages like, hey, you know, you've been in the house now for whatever, so and so long. How about you go for a walk right now? Or again, they were trying to sense in mood states like depression and anxiety, and we're trying to design just-in-time interventions for those mood states as well. And what they found is that they were able to help patients with depression. This was a very early study in this stage. And just a word of caution here, what worked very well was the location tracking. So it was relatively easy to find out whether a patient had been stuck in a location and then to send an intervention. It was much harder to track when their mood was going downhill and then to intervene accordingly. So mood tracking is much more challenging than tracking those categorical states, which kind of makes sense, like where you are or so. But anyways, this was an early study for people with depression with somewhat encouraging results. They had 8 patients, but as I keep saying throughout these talks, we still have to be really, really careful in this space, because once again, I think our excitement about this work and our enthusiasm is really outpacing what these phone-based interventions can do at this point. I think we'll ultimately get there, but there are so many challenges still. You know, just think about the variability of phones that there are out there. And then all of these different phones, they have different manufacturers, and then they have different operating systems, and then there are different versions of these operating systems. And all of that leads to very, very messy data. Or actually, even if you think about variability between individuals or how we all carry those phones, some of us might carry them on their body, others carry them in their hand, we might use them a little bit differently. So all of this variability in the data makes this type of work very exciting. But nevertheless, even though we have to be cautious, I think ultimately we might end up what I think is a very promising future here, where we might have a comprehensive mental health platform where we will be able to integrate all of those different pieces I was just talking about. So ultimately, we might be able to integrate the sensor-based assessment I was just talking about, perhaps even with information that's currently in the electronic medical record, right? And there could be a lot of useful information in there. There could be treatment history in there. There could even be lab data in there that might give us some information about genetic risk for a patient. There might be an MRI scan in there. And then, of course, that can also be combined with our good old clinical assessment measures. They're not necessarily paper and pencil measures anymore. Most of these assessments are now done on a tablet or a phone. But all of this information, the sensor-based data, what's in the electronic medical record, as well as our clinical assessments, all of that data could be combined. And then ultimately, we might be able to use machine learning algorithms in order to help us recommend a personalized treatment plan for any particular individual, right? And the way this might look like is that after this very detailed and comprehensive assessment, a patient might be recommended, for example, to go forward with behavioral activation, for example, or with cognitive bias modification. And then on top of that, you also have to think about what kind of level of therapist support will this particular individual need, right? So some people, maybe people who are struggling a little bit more, people who are more severely ill might need a live therapist still, of course, right? But then people who are higher functioning or who really like technology-based interventions, they might not even want that at all, right? Their level of support might be peer support, or they might like a chatbot much better. And before I let you go, I just want to say a few more words. So, and Bruce already talked about my kids, so I'm going to talk about my kids for a second. So I have two. I have two teenage kids at home, and like any parents, I often drive them around. And very often, so let's say I'm driving my son around, and he's in the car with a bunch of boys from his soccer team, and I look at them. And maybe after a soccer game, they might be a little bit tired, and they're all sitting in the phone, and they're all looking at they're all sitting in the car, and they're all looking at their phones, right? And they might be catching up with what's happening in social media or so. And I'm looking at them, and I'm thinking, wow, these kids, they didn't grow up in a world where not everybody has phones. They're so used to everybody having phones at all times and communicating in this way. And there was a really fascinating article about this in The Atlantic just about a year ago. It was an article by Jean Twenge. And she was writing about how teenagers these days are much more likely to be home with their smartphones, checking out social media and so on. And they're much more likely to do that than previous generations. And therefore, they tend to have sex much later, and they start drinking much later, and they're not as likely to go out drunk driving, for example. And all the parents in the audience are probably thinking like, oh, this is great. My kids safe at home, safely tucked away. Nothing bad happens to them. But there's actually also a dark side to that. And that is when you look at those kids, they very often report being much more lonely now than previous generations. And they often report that they feel like they're missing out when they're on social media and they see their friends having fun, attending a fun event, and they're not part of it, or they're noticing that their friends are getting all of these likes on the photos that their friends are putting up, and they don't. And it actually has been found that increases in depression and anxiety have been linked to smartphone use. And of course, we can't blame all of the increases in depression and also suicidality on smartphones, but there's definitely a number of correlational studies coming out, and actually some studies now even that point towards causality. So what can we do as adults? What can we do? Well, one obvious thing is obviously that we model good smartphone use, right, for that next generation. But another thing for therapists and for parents too, I guess, is to tell kids to get off the phone and get into their lives and to do something that doesn't involve a screen, I guess. But I wonder if we can take it a little bit further, and if we could actually use the phone to help here as well. Maybe if the phone could track when those kids have been on social media for too long, and the phone could actually develop an intervention and say, hey, it's time to go out and do something different. And now it's going to get a little bit wild, but what about what about if we take it one step further? And what if we were to take all of that research on emotion tracking now, and what if we were to track those kids? And what if we were to provide them with just-in-time interventions once we begin to notice that there's something wrong, right? That those kids are at risk for getting sick. And now, of course, there's huge privacy considerations and ethical considerations, but it's just something for all of us to think about and to wrestle with, because those phones are not going to go away. Technology is not going to go away, right? So we might as well figure out how we use it for good, so to speak. And that brings me pretty much to the end of my talk. So just to summarize, we've talked a little bit about the mental health crisis, and we discussed that most people with mental health issues are not getting any care at all, or of those who do, many don't get good care. And then we talked about how technology might provide a solution, because technology is already infiltrating every aspect of our life anyway, right? And it offers scalable approaches to both assessment as well as treatment. And technology will continue to evolve so rapidly, so it's so important for all of us to stay informed and to know what's going on in that space. And we also talked about how technology has very serious risks, but it can also have major benefits. And those benefits might help us to address several, but not all of the problems, of course, that we are dealing with regard to the mental health crisis. And I think we have to seriously think about what our role can be as we are trying to maximize the benefits of technology for our patients. Thank you very much for listening.
So before we all adjourn, thank you for all staying. Usually when I get up here, everyone goes for the door. So I just want to present a gift, and I'd like you to join me in thanking Sabine for her generous leadership and her service to our association. Okay, thank you everybody, and lace up those dancing shoes. We'll see you at the party at 10:30 in Atlanta next November. Thank you.